I didn't cry at my husband's funeral, not when they lowered the casket, not when his sister wailed like the world had ended, and not even when my children clung to my arms like they were afraid I'd disappear too. I just stood there, frozen, numb, a statue dressed in black. For 40 years, I had built a life beside that man, Walter Rhodes, and in the end, I couldn't even bring myself to grieve. A week after we buried him, a package arrived at my doorstep. It was small, wrapped in cream-colored paper with gold trim and tucked beneath a pile of condolence cards that I hadn't bothered to open. The sender's name was neatly printed in cursive on the front, Elise Monroe. I stared at it for a full minute before I touched it. Elise Monroe, the woman my husband swore was just someone from work. The name that had hovered like smoke in our marriage's final years, never fully visible, but impossible to ignore. I had never seen her face, but I knew who she was. I almost threw it away. I should have. But curiosity is a cruel thing. And somewhere beneath the grief and anger was something colder. I wanted to know what she had to say now that he was gone. I opened the package on my kitchen counter, the same spot where Walter used to leave my morning coffee for decades. Inside was a silk scarf, lavender, the exact shade I used to wear every spring, and under it, folded carefully, was a letter. Not from her, from him. I didn't realize I had sunk to the floor until I heard the sharp clink of the ceramic mug I'd dropped. It shattered beside my foot, but I didn't flinch. I held the letter like it was burning through my skin. His handwriting was instantly familiar. Looping, slanted to the right. My breath caught in my throat. This letter wasn't written to her, it was written to me. Right there, on that cold tile floor, I started to cry. Not because he was gone, but because I knew, before I read a single word, that everything I believed about my marriage was about to change. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Before everything fell apart, my life looked almost picture perfect, at least from the outside. I was Vivian Rhodes, a retired school librarian in Savannah, Georgia, known for my blueberry cobbler, floral blouses, and quiet presence at church every Sunday. I'd been married to Walter since I was 21. He was charming back then, tall, broad-shouldered, with a firm handshake and the kind of deep voice that made people listen. He sold insurance, but he made it sound like an art form. We lived in a 2-story colonial home that I kept spotless, not because anyone asked me to, but because I liked the feeling of calm it brought. Our children, Lauren and Dylan, had grown and moved away, but they still called every Sunday like clockwork. Lauren was a pediatric nurse in Charleston, and Dylan worked in IT up in Raleigh. We raised them right. We gave them stability. I thought we had given them an example of what love was supposed to look like. My days had a rhythm. I'd wake up to the smell of fresh coffee. Walter always made it before heading to the office, and find my favorite mug waiting for me on the counter. Sometimes there'd be a note, going to be home late, or dinner with a client, nothing suspicious, just routine. After breakfast, I'd work in the garden. I loved the smell of damp soil, the feel of the earth beneath my nails. Walter used to joke that I treated my roses better than him. Maybe I did. At least they bloomed when I gave them attention. Evenings were quiet. We'd eat dinner together, usually something I'd cooked from scratch, and watch reruns of Jeopardy! He'd read the paper, and I'd knit or read a novel. Occasionally, we'd have a glass of wine. He'd kiss my cheek goodnight and roll over in bed without saying much. It wasn't passionate, but after 40 years, I didn't expect sparks. I expected peace, and I thought we had that. I didn't realize I had slowly become more habit than wife. I was part of his life the way wallpaper is part of a room. Comforting, familiar, and entirely overlooked. Looking back, there were little cracks. A shift in his tone when I'd ask how his day went. A growing distance when we visited family. He began spending more time at the office. Sometimes he'd cancel our plans last minute, always with a reasonable excuse. But I trusted him. That was the cornerstone of our marriage. Trust. I believed we were partners. I believed we had made it past the hard parts and earned the right to coast through our golden years with grace. We had paid off our mortgage, planned a cruise for our 45th anniversary, and talked about becoming grandparents one day. I didn't think I was living in a lie. I thought I was living in the reward of decades of shared effort. The truth is, I was comfortable, and comfort can be a dangerous disguise for complacency. I didn't ask too many questions because I didn't want to hear answers that might shake the fragile peace we had. I ignored the flickers of doubt because they seemed selfish. After all, wasn't Walter providing? Wasn't he coming home at night? Wasn't that enough? It's amazing how much you'll overlook when you believe you're loved. I used to host Sunday dinners for the whole family once a month. I'd set the table with our best china, cook Walter's favorite roast, and watch him laugh with Dylan over bourbon. Lauren would help me wash the dishes and whisper that she hoped to have a marriage like mine someday. I'd smile, press her hand, and tell her it was all about patience and kindness. I believed it when I said it. Now I look back at that woman and feel a mix of pity and awe. She had no idea that the life she built was standing on rotted wood. But she believed in what she had. And maybe that's what made the betrayal hurt so much. Not just that he broke his vows, but that he let her live in a dream while he chased something else behind closed doors. The first red flag wasn't loud. It didn't come with screaming matches or lipstick on a collar. It was subtle. A small flicker in the background of our everyday life that I noticed, dismissed, and then learned to ignore. It happened on a Thursday. Walter had come home late. Again. That in itself wasn't unusual. He often said he had client meetings or paperwork to finish. But that night, something was different. When he kissed my cheek, I smelled perfume on his collar. Not the kind I wore. I hadn't changed brands in years. This one was expensive, musky, almost theatrical. It clung to him in a way that felt too deliberate. "New client," he said casually, pulling off his jacket and loosening his tie. "She gave me a hug when she signed the policy." I laughed, unsure why I felt uneasy. Hope she bought the expensive plan then. He smiled, poured himself a drink, and changed the subject. And just like that, it was brushed aside. But the feeling lingered. A quiet unease settled in my chest, like a whisper I couldn't quite hear. I remember folding laundry the next morning and pausing over one of his shirts, the one he'd worn that day. I brought it to my nose. The same perfume, faint but unmistakable. It was like a ghost left behind. I could have asked him again. But I didn't. I told myself I was imagining things. We had been married 40 years. He was a man of habits, and I trusted those habits more than I trusted my own instincts. But then came the second moment, a sharper one. A week later, we were having dinner together. I'd made baked salmon and roasted asparagus, one of his favorites. We were halfway through the meal when his phone buzzed. He didn't usually keep it on the table. He glanced at it quickly, then flipped it over without saying a word. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, chewing. "Just work." I nodded, but my eyes had already caught the screen before he flipped it. A name I didn't recognize. Elise. "Who's Elise?" I asked, keeping my voice light. He didn't even flinch. "New hire. She's helping with admin stuff. Bright girl." "Pretty name," I said. He smiled, but not at me. After dinner, he went into the study and shut the door. I stood at the sink, washing dishes and staring at the closed door. That was new. He'd never used to close it. Over the next few weeks, I noticed other changes. He was more distracted. He smiled at his phone more than at me. He started wearing cologne again, the same one he used when we first dated. I wanted to believe he was just going through a phase, maybe trying to feel young again. But I also knew what it looked like when someone began to emotionally withdraw. I'd seen it in other marriages, in friends, neighbors, even my own parents. Still, I held on to the belief that this was temporary, a rough patch. Maybe he was depressed. Maybe he was working too hard. Maybe I wasn't doing enough to make him feel wanted. That thought alone made me sick. But I thought if I cooked more of his favorite meals, wore lipstick again, surprised him with weekend plans, maybe I could bring him back to me. So I tried. One night I made a candle-lit dinner. Filet mignon, roasted potatoes, his favorite Merlot. He came home an hour late. I had to reheat the meal twice. When he walked in, he barely noticed the candles. "What's all this?" he asked, loosening his tie, not even meeting my eyes. "Just wanted to do something special," I said. He sat down, glanced at the food, and mumbled, "You didn't have to go through all this trouble." Trouble. That's what it had become. My love, my effort. Trouble. He ate half the meal, then said he was too tired to finish. He kissed my forehead like I was his aunt, not his wife, and went to bed early. That night, I lay awake in the dark staring at the ceiling. That perfume, that name, that smile at the phone. Something was wrong, and I knew it. But I still clung to the lie that this was just a phase. Because admitting anything else would have shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. The problem with slow heartbreak is that it doesn't make a scene. It doesn't scream or slam doors. It tiptoes in, silent, invisible, until one day you look around and realize there's nothing left to hold on to. That was how it felt, being married to Walter in those final years. The man I once shared everything with had become a polite stranger who lived in my house and slept beside me. He still took out the trash, paid the bills, and mowed the lawn. But he didn't see me anymore. Not really. It started with little things. He stopped asking me how I slept. He'd eat the dinner I cooked without saying a word, then disappear into the study until bedtime. When we sat on the couch to watch TV, he kept a cushion between us. There were no more goodnight kisses, no more reaching for my hand. At first, I tried to bridge the silence. I'd talk about the neighbors, the kids, a book I was reading. He'd nod, maybe give a one-word reply, but his eyes were always somewhere else, somewhere I wasn't. I remember the exact moment I realized I had become invisible. It was during a doctor's appointment. Walter had been having trouble with his blood pressure, so I went with him to a checkup. When the doctor asked about his stress levels, Walter chuckled and said, "Nothing I can't handle. My job keeps me busy. My wife mostly keeps to herself. I mostly keep to myself." I sat there, stunned. Not because it wasn't true, but because it wasn't always true. I used to be his sounding board, his anchor, the woman who stayed up late helping him sort receipts during tax season, who rubbed his shoulders after long days. And now I was just background noise. After that, I stopped trying so hard. I stopped setting the table with candles. I stopped folding his socks the way he liked. I started eating dinner alone some nights. He didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he never mentioned it. On Sundays, I'd call Lauren and Dylan and try not to let my voice crack. I told them everything was fine. I didn't want to burden them. They had their own lives, and besides, what would I even say? That their father was drifting away while still sleeping in my bed? That I felt lonelier in marriage than I ever had on my own? I turned to routines for comfort. I cleaned more, polished the silverware, rearranged the linen closet. I went for long walks through the neighborhood just to feel the wind on my face. At least nature still acknowledged me. The worst part wasn't the absence of affection. It was the absence of concern. I could have vanished and he wouldn't have noticed until he needed clean shirts. One night, I made the mistake of asking, "Do you still love me?" He didn't look up from his laptop. "Why would you ask something like that?" I shrugged. "You just seem far away lately." He sighed, like my pain was an inconvenience. "We've been married 40 years, Vivian. You know how I feel." But I didn't. Not anymore. And I realized something chilling. He hadn't said, "I love you" in months, maybe longer. So I stopped saying it too. I began to shrink inside myself. I stopped wearing the jewelry he bought me. I stopped humming when I cooked. I even stopped bringing up our anniversary just to see if he would. He didn't. I felt like a ghost in my own home, not angry, just tired. Some days I would stare at our wedding photo on the hallway wall. The young woman in the white dress, her hand tucked under his arm, eyes filled with hope. I'd wonder what she would think of me now, what advice she would give. Would she tell me to fight for him or to start fighting for myself? I wasn't sure yet, but I knew this. Something inside me had begun to wither. The love I had poured so freely for decades was drying up, and the woman I used to be was fading. Slowly, but surely. It was Dylan's birthday, and for once I had convinced Walter to come. He had been dodging family gatherings more often, always citing work or exhaustion, but Dylan was his only son, and I guilted him into showing up. We were at Lauren's house. She'd recently moved back to Savannah with her husband and baby girl, and she'd decorated the place beautifully with little banners and homemade cupcakes. Everyone was in good spirits, everyone but me. I'd spent the entire morning putting myself together. I wore a navy blue dress Walter had once complimented, spritzed on my favorite perfume, and even curled my hair. I wanted to look presentable, like the woman he used to see when he looked at me. At first, everything seemed fine. He kissed Dylan on the back, handed over a bottle of bourbon as a gift, and joked with Lauren about her over-baked lasagna. But then his phone buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times. He glanced at it, excused himself from the table, and stepped onto the back porch with it pressed to his ear. Through the glass door, I watched his face light up. Not like he did when Dylan told a good story or when our granddaughter called him Papa. No, this was something else. He was smiling. Really smiling. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the tone. I'd spoken in that tone when we were young and flirtatious, when he'd call me from hotel rooms on business trips and whisper that he missed me. Now he was speaking to someone else that way. He had forgotten the glass was transparent. Lauren noticed too. She leaned in and whispered, "Is that Elise?" I turned to her sharply. "What?" She looked regretful, like she hadn't meant to say it aloud. "I saw a message on his phone once. A couple months ago, I didn't want to start anything." I felt the blood drain from my face. Elise. So it wasn't just me. I wasn't imagining her. She was real. Known. Obvious. 10 minutes passed before he came back inside. He didn't explain himself, didn't apologize. He just picked up his fork and resumed eating like nothing had happened. Everyone pretended not to notice, but the air had shifted. The silence around the table was thick. Then Dylan tried to lift the mood. He said something like, "Well, I hope Dad isn't planning any wild affairs now that he's got time on his hands." It was meant as a joke, but Walter laughed, too hard. Then, without thinking, he muttered under his breath, "Depends on the mistress." Time stopped. My hand, frozen in mid-air with a fork of potato, trembled. Lauren's eyes went wide. Dylan looked confused, maybe assuming it was a crude joke, but I knew it wasn't a joke at all. I excused myself quietly. No tears, no anger. I walked to the guest bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the tub. I didn't cry. Not right away. I just stared at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. The woman looking back at me was perfectly put together, lips painted, eyes lined, but something in her expression was empty. She looked like a woman playing a part. I clenched the sides of the sink and bowed my head. There, in the middle of my son's birthday, I had been humiliated, not in front of a crowd of strangers, but in the company of those I loved most. And that made it worse, because now my children knew. Now they saw it too. The cracks in the marriage I had worked so hard to keep from showing. And the worst part? Walter didn't care. I waited until I heard people laughing again before I stepped out. I rejoined the table with a smile like nothing had happened. I finished my meal. I cleared the plates. I hugged my children goodbye. Walter drove us home, humming along to the radio as if he hadn't just embarrassed me in front of our family. That night, in bed, he rolled over and fell asleep in minutes. I lay beside him, wide awake, listening to his breathing. That was the night I stopped hoping for him to notice me again. After Dylan's birthday, something shifted in me. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was hollow. A woman still standing inside a life that no longer recognized her. Every glance from Walter felt like it passed right through me, like I was made of fog. He no longer hid Elise. He didn't bother. He had the audacity to come home smelling like her, to mutter her name in his sleep once, and then chuckle in the morning like it didn't matter. And I let it happen. Because I didn't know what else to do. I'd spent 40 years keeping a house warm, raising children, and building a life around a man who no longer saw me as a woman, but as a convenience. I thought I had outgrown heartbreak, but you never do. Not when the betrayal comes from someone who once whispered your name like a prayer. I didn't pack a suitcase. I didn't slam any doors. I didn't even cry. Instead, I began to disappear from the inside out. I stopped setting 2 plates at dinner. I started going for walks alone, further than usual, letting the wind slap at my cheeks just to remind myself I was alive. I stopped doing his laundry. I no longer asked where he was going or when he'd be back. There was no point. The answers didn't belong to me anymore. One morning, I passed by the study and saw him on a video call. He was smiling. That real, warm smile I hadn't seen in years. The one I once believed was mine. I stood quietly in the hallway just out of view and listened. "Elise," he said softly, "I can't keep doing this much longer. I'm going to talk to her. Soon." I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just stood there, holding a basket of clean towels, listening to the sound of my marriage disintegrating sentence by sentence. It was almost a relief. The truth had finally caught up to me. Spoken out loud, undeniable. That night, I waited until he fell asleep. I went to the garage and sat in the car for nearly 2 hours. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there, staring at the dark driveway, the cracked paint on the garage door, the place I had called home for 4 decades, and I thought, what am I waiting for? For him to leave me? For him to tell me what I already know? For my children to pity me? Number. That wasn't how my story would end. The next morning, I made coffee. Just 1 mug. I dressed, called a cab, and went to a motel on the edge of town. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a message. I just walked away. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet and deliberate. A single woman, age 61, stepping into a rented room with floral curtains and a musty carpet, breathing air that didn't carry his scent. That first night alone, I sat on the edge of the motel bed and stared at my suitcase. I had only brought the essentials. I didn't want memories. I didn't want keepsakes. I needed space. Physical, emotional, spiritual. I needed to remember who I was before Walter told me who I had to be. Lauren called that evening. She had stopped by the house and realized I was gone. "Mom," she asked, her voice tight, "where are you?" I paused, then said softly, "Somewhere I can finally breathe." She didn't ask for details. She just whispered, "Okay." I stayed in that motel for 3 weeks. I walked every morning, wrote in a journal, and started looking at rental listings. I saw myself in the mirror more clearly every day. The lines on my face, the tired, sunken eyes, but beneath it, a spark. A quiet strength that hadn't been extinguished, just buried. People thought I had been pushed out, but the truth is, I walked. I left because I realized staying would be another betrayal, this one against myself. Everyone assumed that would be the end of my story, but in reality, it was just the first real beginning I had had in years. 3 weeks after leaving Walter, I found myself sitting on the edge of a narrow twin bed in a 1-bedroom rental apartment above a shuttered bakery. The floors creaked, the ceiling fan made a soft ticking sound, and the water in the sink turned rusty if you let it run too long. But it was mine. Every chipped tile, every uneven cupboard, it was mine. I thought that once I left him, I'd feel free, empowered, maybe even proud. But instead, I felt Nothing. Not relief, not sadness, not even anger. Just silence. That kind of silence seeps into your bones. It's not the peaceful kind. It's the kind that makes the walls feel closer than they are and turns the air heavy in your lungs. I would wake up at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, my heart racing, convinced that I'd made a mistake. I'd reach for the other side of the bed and remember, he wasn't there. And more than that, he didn't care. I had spent most of my adult life taking care of someone else. When Walter got sick, I made soup and rubbed his back. When he had deadlines, I proofread his reports. When he bought me birthday presents last minute, I smiled and told him I loved them anyway. My entire identity had been wrapped in service: wife, mother, caretaker. Now, stripped of those titles, I wasn't sure what was left. The days blended together. I walked to the corner store, picked up microwave dinners, and ate on the couch in silence. The TV played old crime shows I'd seen 100 times. I didn't laugh. I didn't cry. I just existed. It was during one of those nights, maybe the 5th or 6th, when the numbness cracked. I had just finished eating and I was scrolling through my phone, rereading old texts. There weren't many from Walter, mostly one-word answers. Okay, sure, later. I kept scrolling further and further back, years back, looking for any proof that we had once been in love. I found one. It was from 2009, a photo he had sent of a beach sunset with the message, "Wish you were here." That was it, just that. I stared at the photo until my eyes blurred, and then it hit me. The full weight of it. I had poured my entire heart into a man who, for the last decade, had spoken to me with less effort than a coworker in an elevator. I dropped the phone. My body curled in on itself like it was trying to hide, and then the sobs came. Ugly, heaving, soul-crushing sobs. I cried into a towel because I didn't have the energy to find tissues. My ribs hurt. My throat burned. It felt like I was being scraped out from the inside. That night, I hit rock bottom. I remember crawling to the bathroom floor. It was cool and hard, and just lying there, cheek pressed against the tile, like maybe the ground could absorb some of the pain. I whispered to no one. Why wasn't I enough? That was the question that haunted me the most. Not why he cheated, not why he lied, but why I, after 40 years of loyalty and devotion, still wasn't enough to make him stay. I fell asleep on that bathroom floor. When I woke up, the sun was pouring through the frosted window. My head throbbed, my back ached. But I was still here. And in that moment, I realized something. I had nothing left to give anyone else. And maybe that meant I could finally start giving something to myself. I brewed a cup of instant coffee and took it out to the tiny fire escape outside my apartment window. The air was brisk, sharp against my cheeks. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sipped slowly. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone to rescue me. There was no one coming. And strangely, that truth wasn't as frightening as it had once been. It was honest, pure. It meant that whatever came next, it would come from me. It was a gray, rainy Tuesday when the package arrived. I hadn't been expecting anything. I wasn't ordering things online or getting mail outside of bills. But there it was, sitting in front of my apartment door, small, neatly wrapped. The handwriting on the label was unfamiliar, careful cursive, like someone who still believed in stationery and manners. Sender, Elise Monroe. I stood in the hallway for a long time just staring at it. I felt my fingers twitch. I should have left it there. I should have turned around and gone back inside, but I didn't. I picked it up and walked back into my apartment, heart pounding like it had its own thoughts. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at it like it was a bomb that might detonate. Why would she send me anything? What could she possibly want to say? A cruel apology? A smug note from a woman who won? My hand hovered over the edge of the tape. Part of me wanted to throw it away unopened, to reclaim some sliver of dignity by refusing whatever explanation she thought I needed. But another part of me, The part still searching for meaning after all the wreckage peeled the tape back slowly. Inside the box was a lavender silk scarf. It was elegant and expensive, and it was mine, or had been. It was the exact scarf I had lost years ago, a birthday gift from Lauren, monogrammed with my initials. I hadn't seen it since Walter and I attended a holiday gala hosted by his office. I'd assumed I'd left it behind or dropped it somewhere that night. I never thought to ask Walter about it. Why would I? And yet, here it was, returned to me by the woman who had taken my husband. I stared at the scarf, heart racing, confused, angry, and strangely intrigued. Beneath it was a sealed envelope, no address, no salutation, just Vivian in Walter's handwriting. I hadn't seen his writing since signing probate forms after his death. The second I recognized the loops and slight lean of his letters, I felt like the floor tilted beneath me. I tore it open with trembling fingers. The letter was dated 3 months before his stroke. Vivian, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and Elise has kept her word. I never deserved your kindness, your patience, or the life you built around me. I ruined what we had. I know that now. I knew it even when I was doing it. Elise wasn't just a mistake, she was a wake-up call. Not because she loved me, she didn't, but because she forced me to see what I had become. A man who looked into the eyes of the woman who stood beside him through every storm and saw a shadow instead of a partner. I thought I wanted freedom. I thought I wanted someone who made me feel young again, but all it did was show me how far I had drifted from the man I used to be. The man you married. Elise told me to be honest with you. I couldn't bring myself to say it while I was alive. I was too ashamed. I never stopped loving you. I just stopped deserving you. Please don't let my weakness become your burden. You were never the problem. I am so sorry. Walter. I didn't move for a long time. I read the letter 3 times, the words sinking in deeper each time. At first I felt rage. I wanted to scream, to tear the letter in half, to curse his name for the years he stole from me. But then something broke open inside of me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a sudden, dizzying understanding. It had never been about me. He didn't betray me because I lacked something. He betrayed me because he lacked the courage to tell the truth. And somehow, Elise, the woman I had imagined as the villain in every quiet heartbreak, had been the one to hand me the truth when he couldn't. Not for herself, for me. The scarf slipped through my fingers and landed softly on my lap. I cried then, not for him, but for the woman I had been all those years, for the silence she endured, for the dignity she preserved, and for the clarity she finally received. The morning after I read Walter's letter, I didn't reach for the remote. I didn't heat up a microwave breakfast. I didn't check the time or scroll through my phone. I just sat in that same chair at the kitchen table, with the letter resting in front of me like a mirror to my past. Everything was the same. The cracked coffee mug, the humming fridge, the faint sound of rain. But I was different, because for the first time in years, I wasn't confused. The pain was still there, of course, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the kind of pain that makes you question your worth. It wasn't humiliation anymore. It was grief, raw human grief for a man I had once loved and for the future we never made it to. And underneath the grief was something I hadn't felt in years, a quiet, stubborn strength. I stood up, walked to the mirror in the hallway, and really looked at myself. I didn't see a broken woman. I saw someone who had been lied to, abandoned, humiliated, and was still standing. I saw the streaks of silver in my hair, the softness around my eyes, the creases around my mouth. They didn't make me invisible. They made me real. I wasn't ashamed anymore. Walter's confession, if you could call it that, didn't excuse what he did, but it gave me a thread of truth, and that thread pulled something loose inside me. I realized I had spent too long assigning my pain a meaning it never earned. I thought if I had been more interesting, more affectionate, thinner, funnier, more adventurous, maybe he wouldn't have left. But it was never about what I lacked. It was about what he was too weak to face. I took the letter and folded it gently, placing it back into the envelope. I tucked it inside an old recipe box I hadn't opened since before Walter died. It used to hold his favorite meal plans. Now, it held my closure. That day, I opened all the windows in the apartment. I let the rain-soaked air fill the room. I played music, not soft background music, but real music, the kind that forces you to feel. Aretha Franklin, Nina Simone. I sang along, badly, and danced barefoot on the cold wooden floors. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was small and defiant. I cooked real food for the first time since I'd left the house, not frozen or processed. I chopped vegetables seasoned by instinct and set the table for one, not in mourning, but in recognition. I was no longer waiting for someone to come home. I was home. The next day, I walked into town and bought a new journal. I wrote on the first page, "I am not what was done to me. I am what I decide to do with it." I started writing every morning, not just about Walter, but about everything. My childhood, my dreams, the years I gave up and the ones I wanted to reclaim. The act of writing reminded me that I had a voice, that I could fill pages, that I mattered. Later that week, I took a walk past the park where Walter and I once took the kids. There was a bench near the swings where we used to sit. I walked up to it, expecting it to trigger something painful, but it didn't. It just looked like an old bench. Time had done its job. I passed by a local community center with a flyer in the window. Memoir Writing Workshop. Thursdays, 6 p.m. Women 50 plus encouraged to join. I stared at it, heart fluttering. I hadn't been in a room full of strangers since before the pandemic. I hadn't shared my story out loud with anyone. But maybe it was time. Maybe I wasn't just surviving anymore. Maybe I was beginning again. I walked inside and signed up. That night, I didn't feel sad when I brushed my teeth alone or slipped under cool sheets with no one beside me. I didn't ache when I turned off the lamp, because for the first time in a long, long time, I wasn't mourning what I lost. I was growing into who I could become. I didn't need to make an announcement. There was no social media post about finding myself, no group text to the kids saying, "I'm doing better now." Healing didn't come with confetti. It came quietly, like the first signs of spring after a brutal winter. And I didn't tell anyone what I was doing because, for once, I wasn't doing it for anyone but me. After signing up for the writing workshop, I went straight to the library. It had been years since I walked through the doors not as someone's wife or mother, but just as Vivian. I found a section on memoir writing, checked out 3 books, and spent the next few days at my small kitchen table, scribbling notes in the margins of a yellow legal pad. I also called a lawyer. Walter's estate was still in probate, and although he hadn't updated his will in over a decade, everything was still legally mine. The house, the business accounts, even the vacation property in North Carolina I had forgotten we still owned. I wanted answers. I wanted closure. But more than anything, I wanted to understand where I stood, not emotionally, but financially. The lawyer was a woman named Corinne Jensen, mid-40s, sharp-eyed and direct. She didn't talk down to me, which was refreshing. "Your husband made some unusual financial moves in his final year," she told me during our second meeting. "We're tracking down some unlisted accounts, possibly an off-the-books trust. You'll want to be ready for a few surprises." I almost laughed. I've gotten good at surprises, but behind my calm tone was something firmer. Resolve. I no longer flinched when Walter's name was mentioned. I no longer questioned what he felt. I was done searching for answers that only left me emptier. Now I was preparing for life without him, for a future without apology. While Corinne worked on the financial side, I began fixing other parts of my life. I updated my will. I added Lauren and Dylan as joint beneficiaries, but I made it clear no spouse of theirs could touch a cent unless I said so. That wasn't about bitterness. It was about clarity. I had spent too many years giving too much away without asking what I needed in return. I also signed up for a self-defense class. It was something Elise had mentioned in a post I found. Buried in a Google search, I finally allowed myself to make. Strength isn't just surviving. Sometimes it's throwing a punch when no one believes you can. I hated how much that line stayed with me, but it did. So I enrolled in a Tuesday night class at the Y. I was the oldest woman in the room, but I never missed a session. I started keeping receipts for everything. I tracked expenses, cut unnecessary costs, and canceled subscriptions Walter had set up without my knowledge. I was reclaiming not just my voice, but control over my own life. And still, I said nothing. When Lauren called and asked how I was feeling, I told her I was taking things day by day. When Dylan asked if I needed anything, I thanked him, but said I was doing okay. I didn't need to prove anything to them, or to anyone. I was quietly, methodically rebuilding. Every step I took became a brick in the new foundation of my life. Each decision, small or large, was made with intention. Not for show, not to make a statement, but to reinforce something in me that had grown weak from neglect. I even redecorated the apartment. I went to thrift shops, picked out art that made me feel something, bought throw pillows in wild, joyful colors. I replaced the bland beige lamp with a bright blue one that looked like it belonged in a beach cottage. Slowly, the space began to reflect the woman I was becoming. Not polished, not perfect, but deeply personal. I hadn't forgiven Walter, but I had forgiven myself for staying too long, for shrinking too often, for trusting someone who didn't deserve it. Now I was preparing for the life that came after the storm, not with noise, but with quiet determination. No one knew what I was doing behind the scenes, and that's what made it powerful. The first sign that the balance had shifted wasn't dramatic. It came in the form of a voicemail. "Hey Vivian, just wondering if you've had a chance to speak with the estate attorney. There are a few things we might need to review together. Give me a call when you can." It was Elise. Her voice was calm, but there was tension in the edges, carefully measured politeness. She didn't know yet that I had already spoken to Corinne, that I had reviewed Walter's financial records, that I had seen everything. The private lease Walter had taken out in Elise's name, the payments he had been making from our joint account, the life he'd been quietly building with her while I stood beside him, blind and loyal. I didn't return the call. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the silence that unnerves people the most. I had spent decades responding to every need, every question, every shift in emotion from the people around me, especially Walter. But now, I answered to no one. And that silence, it had weight. Elise called again. This time, she didn't leave a message. Later that week, I got a letter in the mail from Walter's business partner. Apparently, Elise had been working in the office in a consulting role for the last 18 months. Unofficially. There were no records, no job title, but there were payments. Walter had paid her under the table, bypassing payroll, which meant bypassing taxes. That's when I realized she had something to lose. Corinne filed the paperwork to freeze remaining assets and audit the business account. Nothing dramatic, just procedure, but Elise would feel it. Lauren came over one afternoon holding a bottle of wine and a box of pastries. She looked around my small apartment and said, "It's so cozy here. Peaceful." I smiled and handed her a cup of coffee. "It's mine." She sat across from me and reached for my hand. I was angry at Dad for a long time. I didn't know how much he'd changed until you were gone. I squeezed her hand but didn't say anything, because she was wrong. He hadn't changed. He just stopped pretending. That Sunday, Dylan invited me to dinner. When I arrived, he pulled me aside and said, I looked her up. "Elise." I thought about reaching out. I shook my head. No need. He looked at me with confusion. But don't you want? I already have what I need. And I did. I had answers. I had space. I had clarity. What could Elise possibly give me that I hadn't already reclaimed for myself? Still, the universe has a way of tying up loose ends whether you ask it to or not. 2 weeks later, I received an email from Elise. Not the smug message I had imagined. It was brief, clinical. Vivian, I didn't know he was still living with you until 6 months in. I should have stepped away. I'm sorry for the pain I caused. I hope the letter gave you something that he never could in life. Truth. Elise. I read it once, then deleted it. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need her guilt. I didn't need her at all. But I did notice something else. The subtle desperation in her words. She wanted to be seen as decent. She wanted to be acknowledged. She wanted to be part of my story in a way that justified her presence. But she didn't belong in my story anymore. Not now. I belonged to myself. Later that week, Corinne called. We completed the audit. Walter was shifting funds. You're entitled to everything he attempted to divert. She paused. Elise's lease was tied to one of the properties. It's been revoked. She'll have to vacate in 30 days. I felt nothing. Not glee, not revenge. Just a final, quiet click, like a lock turning. There was no need for confrontation, no need for harsh words. Justice wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it came through paperwork and patience. I poured myself a glass of tea, stood at the window, and watched a young couple walk by on the sidewalk, fingers intertwined. The woman laughed, throwing her head back without shame. I smiled, not because I envied her, but because I had been her once. And now I was someone else entirely. The woman who once whispered her needs is gone. In her place stands someone who doesn't ask to be seen. She already knows she is. I never planned to see Elise again. I thought the silence between us would be permanent. Two women connected by betrayal, separated by pain, never destined to face one another directly. But fate, as always, had other plans. It was a Sunday afternoon when it happened. The writing workshop I joined was hosting a public reading, a small event in a downtown bookstore. We were invited to read excerpts from the pieces we'd been working on over the past few months. I wasn't going to participate at first. The idea of sharing my story, my truth with strangers felt like peeling off armor. But the more I wrote, the more I realized that telling the truth was the final piece of healing. So I said yes. The space was intimate. No more than 20 folding chairs set up between rows of biographies and travel guides. There were pitchers of water, a tray of cookies, and the smell of old pages everywhere. The kind of place where people listen with their hearts, not just their ears. I wore a deep maroon blouse and the locket Lauren gave me last Christmas. I had never felt so sure of myself, not even on my wedding day. I was the fourth person to speak. I stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and unfolded my printed pages. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. The story was about a woman who gave up pieces of herself until there was nothing left, who was betrayed not just by her husband, but by her own silence, and who, through quiet rebellion and small choices, began to rebuild. As I spoke, I noticed someone enter from the back. Elise? She slipped in quietly and took a seat near the door. Her hair was darker than I remembered from the few pictures I'd seen. She wore a plain navy jacket, hands folded in her lap, eyes locked on me. I didn't falter. I finished the reading, closed my paper, and stepped away from the mic to a round of gentle applause. I didn't plan to speak to her afterward, but she approached me. "Vivian," she said softly. Her voice was tentative, almost careful. That was beautiful. I looked at her, really looked, and what I saw wasn't a threat. It wasn't a villain. It wasn't even the woman who had taken my husband's attention and affection. It was someone small, worn, maybe even a little lost. "Thank you," I said. There was a long pause. "I thought about writing again," she said. but I wasn't sure I had the right. You had the truth, I replied calmly. That was more than he ever gave me while he was alive. Her eyes welled up a little, but she blinked them dry quickly. I didn't know how much he still relied on you, how much he hadn't let go. I tilted my head. He didn't just rely on me. He built his life on me. You were an escape, but I was the home. She nodded slowly. I didn't come here to justify anything, she said. I just wanted you to know that I listened. I folded my arms gently across my chest. Good, because I wasn't speaking for you. I was speaking for the woman I used to be. Elise looked down at the floor, then back at me. You're stronger than I expected. I always was, I said. I just forgot. She gave a small, respectful nod, then turned and left. No drama, no final words, and that was all I needed. The confrontation wasn't fireworks. It wasn't yelling in a driveway or breaking plates in a kitchen. It was two women standing in the ashes of the same man's mistakes, and one of them walking away without looking back. That evening, Lauren called and asked how the event went. I told her the truth. It felt like breathing for the first time in years. I didn't tell her Elise showed up. I didn't need to. That moment belonged to me. Later, I poured myself a glass of wine, sat on the balcony, and reread the piece I had shared. Not to edit it, just to remember the strength in every line. Because in speaking it out loud, to Elise, to strangers, to myself, I reclaimed more than my voice. I reclaimed my name. Justice doesn't always arrive in a courtroom or in a headline. Sometimes it shows up quietly, in a way that only you recognize. In a moment so personal, so perfectly timed, it feels like the universe finally exhaling on your behalf. It was mid-March when I got the call. Vivian, this is Corinne Jensen. I wanted to update you. We've finished the estate audit. I was at my kitchen table, sipping coffee, the scarf Elise returned draped over the back of the chair. The call was expected, but the tone in Corinne's voice wasn't. It had that deliberate pause professionals use when they're about to say something significant. There's a second letter, she said. It was filed with Walter's safe deposit box. Addressed to you. The bank only released it after probate finalized. Would you like me to forward it? I hesitated. My instinct was to say no. I had read one letter already, one confession, one piece of the truth. But I said yes. 2 days later, it arrived, this time in a legal envelope stamped and notarized. I opened it carefully, sitting down like I was preparing for impact. Inside was a short typed letter. No flowery language, no monologue, just facts. Walter had set up a trust account during the final year of his life. It wasn't in Elise's name, as I feared. It was in mine. It held a significant amount of money, funded not only from his business, but from the sale of assets I didn't even know he had quietly liquidated. Stocks, property, insurance accounts I thought had lapsed. The trust came with a note. Vivian, I couldn't fix what I broke, but I couldn't let you leave empty-handed. You deserved more than what I gave you. Use this for whatever makes you feel free. W. I sat with that letter in my lap for an hour, not because I needed the money, not because it changed anything, but because it confirmed what I had come to accept. Walter had lived a double life, and in the end, he knew which one mattered more. But the justice didn't end there. Later that week, I received a formal notice from the bank regarding Elise. Apparently, Walter had listed her as a secondary signer on an investment account. After his death, she attempted to access it, only to discover he had removed her authorization 6 weeks before he died. She had been left out of the will, excluded from the trust, and her only financial connection to Walter had quietly disappeared. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Because the truth was, Walter had made his choice in silence. In his final months, he had started trying to make things right, in the only way he could. Not through apologies, but through action. And maybe that was the most poetic justice of all. He gave her the fantasy, but he left me the legacy. He gave her passion, but he gave me permanence. I didn't call her. I didn't reply to her last email. I simply lived, and let that be the answer. A month later, I was asked to be a guest speaker at a local women's center. They had heard about my reading at the bookstore and wanted me to share my story with women going through divorce and betrayal. I almost said no, but something inside me, something new and bold, said yes. When I stood at that podium in front of 20 strangers, I didn't read from a paper. I spoke from the heart. I told them about a woman who loved deeply, who lost herself slowly, and who found herself again, not through revenge, but through rediscovery. And when I looked up, I saw a woman in the front row crying quietly. She was about my age, alone, hands clenched in her lap. I met her eyes and said, "You don't need permission to start over. You only need a moment of clarity and the courage to act on it." Afterward, she came up to me, trembling. "Your story, it's mine." I hugged her, not out of sympathy, but out of recognition. That was justice. Not what happened to Elise, but what happened to me. Because the greatest justice of all is becoming the woman no one believed you could be, and knowing you didn't need their belief in the first place. It was early evening when Lauren showed up at my apartment unannounced. I had just finished watering the few potted plants I'd managed to keep alive on my balcony and was settling in with a book when I heard the knock. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded, eyes glassy, and a hesitant smile tugging at her lips. "Got room for one more at dinner?" she asked. I blinked, surprised. "Always?" She came in quietly, set her purse on the table, and immediately began tidying the kitchen. It was a habit she had picked up from me years ago, a small, unconscious way of making space feel like home. For a while, we just cooked together. Nothing fancy, roasted vegetables, grilled chicken, and the same garlic mashed potatoes she used to ask for on her birthdays. We didn't speak much. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was full of meaning. Halfway through our meal, she set down her fork, looked up at me and said, "I'm sorry." I didn't ask why. I just let her speak. I think I knew something was wrong with Dad, deep down. I saw how he looked at his phone more than at you. I saw how you were shrinking. But I didn't say anything. I didn't ask questions. Tears welled up in her eyes. She clenched her napkin like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I kept telling myself it wasn't my business, that you'd tell me if you needed to, but I should have seen you, really seen you. I reached across the table and touched her hand. "You were living your own life, Lauren, and I didn't ask for help. That was on me." She shook her head. "You shouldn't have had to." For a moment, we sat like that, hands locked in a quiet apology. Then she asked something I didn't expect. "Do you ever think about going back? To the house? To that life?" I took a long breath. "No," I said simply. "That life ended long before I walked out the door. I just didn't know it yet." She nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I don't think I ever told you this, but when I was little, I thought you were magic. You always knew where everything was. You could make a room feel warm just by lighting candles and turning on music. You made our house feel like a safe place." A lump formed in my throat. "You still do that, you know," she whispered. "But now, you do it for yourself." That night, after she left, I stood at the window for a long time watching her taillights disappear. I felt something settle in my chest, a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. My daughter didn't come to rescue me. She didn't come out of guilt. She came because she saw me now, not as someone broken or betrayed, but as someone whole. And she wasn't the only one. A few days later, Dylan called. He had been quiet throughout everything, respectful of my space but guarded with his emotions. "Mom," he said, "I found this photo of us at the lake house when I was 10. You were wearing that huge floppy hat and yelling at Dad for forgetting the sunscreen. You looked happy. I smiled into the phone. I remember that day. He paused. I miss that version of you. You might see her again, I said gently. She's still here, just different. He chuckled softly. Better, I think. The next time we all gathered, Lauren, Dylan, my granddaughter in her high chair banging a spoon, it didn't feel forced. No one tiptoed around the past. We didn't bring up Walter. We didn't need to. The air was light, conversation easy. My laugh, real, full, and surprising, came out in a way I hadn't heard in years. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need them to validate my choices. But having them there, not out of pity, but out of love, was a reminder that life hadn't ended. It had shifted. I had shifted. I was no longer the center that held everyone together. I was just me. That was enough. Spring had finally come. Real spring. Not just a shift in temperature, but the kind of slow, blooming rebirth that makes even the air feel different. The kind that carries forgiveness on its breeze, not for others, but for yourself. I sat in my garden that morning. Yes, my garden. A community plot just outside the city, where I had claimed a small rectangle of soil 3 months prior, and poured myself into it like a woman planting more than seeds. Rows of lavender, rosemary, and pale pink roses now curved across the space, like a soft floral signature. The roses were blooming for the first time. I crouched beside them, hands dirty, knees in the grass, and thought of the letter. Walter's letter, the one Elise had returned, was now folded and buried beneath the first rosebush I had planted. I placed it there deliberately, pressing it into the soil with bare hands, as if planting pain into the ground might help it become something else entirely. And it had. Above it now bloomed life, color, fragrance. Not everything had to be burned or erased. Some things could simply be transformed. I closed my eyes, feeling the sun warm my cheeks. Around me, other women worked their plots. A young mother in overalls pulled weeds beside her toddler, who giggled as he splashed in a watering can. An older man in a straw hat nodded at me as he passed, his arms full of marigolds. No one knew my story, and that was the beauty of it. I wasn't Walter's widow here. I wasn't the woman with the cheating husband. I was just Vivian, the one with the blooming rose bushes and the calm, steady presence. I reached for my notebook, the same one I'd been filling since the day I walked into the writing workshop. The pages were nearly full now. Some held finished chapters. Some had scribbled thoughts and poems I would never share. But each word marked a step, a route, a return. At the top of a fresh page, I wrote, "There are many ways to bury the past. In bitterness, in silence, in denial. I chose roses." I smiled and closed the journal. This was peace. Not the fragile peace that depends on silence or denial, but the earned kind, the kind that stands even when the world shakes. The kind built not on promises from others, but promises you make to yourself. That I would never again live quietly just to keep someone else comfortable. That I would never shrink to fit into a version of love that cost me myself. That I would never confuse being needed with being valued. As I sat back, I thought about the woman I had been just 1 year ago. Waking in a cold house, tiptoeing around tension, mistaking emotional neglect for routine. That woman had believed the best years of her life were behind her. She was wrong. I'm 62 now. I live in a small apartment with uneven floors and too much sunlight, and I wouldn't trade it for the house I left behind. I no longer wait for text messages that never come or chase validation from people who call love something they only give conditionally. I drink my coffee slowly. I walk with intention. I write like it matters, because it does. Lauren calls more often now, sometimes just to ask how my garden is doing, sometimes to tell me about a hard day. We don't talk about Walter. We don't have to. There's nothing left to say. Dylan visits with my granddaughter, who toddles into my arms like I'm the only thing in the world that matters. And for those few minutes, I am. The ache is still there, in some quiet part of me. Not for him, but for the time I lost. The parts of myself I gave away too freely. But even grief, when honored properly, becomes a kind of grace. Before I left the garden that day, I snipped one of the roses and tucked it into a glass jar. No ribbon, no card, just a simple reminder. Life blooms again, even after betrayal, even after silence, even after everything, especially after everything. Because sometimes the most powerful story you'll ever tell isn't the one people expect. It's the one you live after you thought the story was already over.